Alright, this is a video for the 5.05 lesson, Culture and Counterculture. With the advent of the student movement, strong anti-war sentiments, and organizations emphasizing free speech, the times they are changing. Bob Dylan was just one voice of the 1960s counterculture that spurned both the draft and the establishment. Woodstock became its symbol as people called for peace and love. In a more political arena, Tom Hayden, Mario Savio, and others challenged traditional policies, rules, values, and authorities, while the student culture responded and changed. Goals for this lesson: recognize the focus of the student movement of the 1960s, and describe the counterculture and its effect on American society. Don't forget to go to lesson resources and grab your reading guide and/or lesson answer key. And let's begin reading pages 848 through 856. Rebellion and Reform. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, many Americans feared that the social fabric of the nation was unraveling. Casualties were mounting in Vietnam. Student protesters were rioting and sometimes bleeding on American campuses. Cities were burning. The apparent comfort and conformity of the 50s seemed like a long-ago daydream. The baby boom children, now grown into college students, took to the streets to march against the war, dropped out of society, and transformed college campuses into scenes of perpetual protest. Parents tried desperately to understand their children's alienation from a society that had given them so much. The generation gap had become an abyss. Adding to the dizzying scene of change, various social groups, including Hispanics, Native Americans, women, gays, and others, took inspiration from the African American Civil Rights Movement and organized to demand greater rights and freedoms. The protest movements of the 60s and 70s altered American culture and attitudes in lasting ways. The rise of the student movement. In the early 1960s, the baby boom children were coming of age. Unlike most of their parents, they had grown up in a relatively stable time. Their childhoods were not shaped by the experiences of economic depression or World War. As young adults, the baby boomers swelled the populations of American high schools and colleges. Not only did more young people attend college, but many colleges and universities greatly expanded to accommodate them. By 1970, there were more than 50 universities with enrollments of at least 15,000 students, with 8 enrolling more than 30,000. And here we have a picture of a peace protest with the large peace sign. Young people who attended these large multiversities could feel lost in the crowd. Students were assigned punch card numbers so that new IBM computer systems could track their course registrations. They attended lectures in large auditoriums and rarely met their professors. One student complained, "They always seem to be wanting to make me into a number. I won't let them. I have a name and I am important enough to be known by it. I'll join any movement that comes along to help me." The desire to join any movement found fulfillment in the new movements formed in the early 60s, fueled by student unrest and dissatisfaction with traditional American values and institutions. Inspired by the Civil Rights Movement and infuriated by the war in Vietnam, millions of students clamored for radical changes in the social order. Their agenda for change was far-reaching. Some were most interested in new social and cultural experiences. Others pursued direct political action. Their politics diverged from the labor issues and union organizing efforts of activists of generations past, sometimes called the Old Left. Instead, the New Left was a mix of ideas and movements, generally anti-war, anti-capitalist, anti-authority, anti-bureaucracy, and pro-freedom in all its forms. Students for a Democratic Society. In 1962, two University of Michigan students, Tom Hayden and Al Haber, leaders of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, gathered young activists at a convention in Port Huron, Michigan. They issued a manifesto known as the Port Huron Statement, which opened by proclaiming, "We are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit." The manifesto identified racism, poverty, and nuclear weapons as critical problems that young people needed to address, though not through patient reform but through radical action. For Hayden and others in the New Left, political action was also a means of personal transformation. Hayden called for a participatory democracy based on the principle that politics has the function of bringing people out of isolation and into community, thus being a means of finding meaning in personal life. Many early members of SDS were veterans of the lunch counter sit-ins and Freedom Summer. Students for a Democratic Society opened chapters on hundreds of college campuses and sponsored civil rights and anti-war protests. Al Haber, the organization's first president, proudly declared, "We have spoken at last with vigor, idealism, and urgency, supporting our words with picket lines, demonstrations, money, and even our own bodies. Pessimism and cynicism have given way to direct action." And here we have a picture of students for a Democratic Society member stage of protest at Columbia University. The free speech movement. Mario Savio, a 21-year-old philosophy major at the University of California at Berkeley, was one of roughly 1,000 white students who traveled to Mississippi in June of 1964 to work with the Freedom Summer campaign. That fall, upon his return to Berkeley, he learned that the university administration had issued a ban on political demonstrations at Sproul Plaza, a central campus location where groups gathered to distribute pamphlets and hold rallies. Savio responded by addressing thousands of students gathered on the plaza to protest the new policy. "Last summer," said Savio, "I went to Mississippi to join the struggle there for civil rights. This fall I am engaged in another phase of the same struggle, this time at Berkeley." Amid loud cheers and applause, Savio declared, "There is a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, it makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even tactily take part, and you've got to put your bodies upon the gears, and upon the wheels, and upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop." Thus began what became known as the free speech movement. What began at Berkeley soon spread to college and high school campuses across the country. Young people everywhere asserted their right to be heard and counted. At college sit-ins and protest rallies, students challenged faculty policies and demanded an end to curfews, dress codes, and strict dormitory visitation rules. Just as many students were rejecting the values of their parents, they also rejected the traditional authority of college administrators to act in loco parentis, a Latin phrase meaning in the place of parents. And here's a Port Huron statement. Okay, let's read a little bit of it. "We are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit. When we were kids, the United States was the wealthiest and strongest country in the world, an initiator of the United Nations that we thought would distribute Western influence throughout the world. Freedom and equality for each individual, government of, by, and for the people. These American values we found good, principles by which we could live as men. Many of us began maturing in complacency. As we grew, however, our comfort was penetrated by events too troubling to dismiss. First, the permeating and victimizing fact of human degradation, symbolized by the Southern struggle against racial bigotry, compelled most of us from silence to activism. Second, the enclosing fact of the Cold War, symbolized by the presence of the bomb, brought awareness that we ourselves and our friends and millions of abstract others we know more directly because of our common peril might die at any time. We might deliberately ignore or avoid or fail to feel all of the human problems, but not these two, for these were too immediate and crushing in their impact, too challenging in the demand that we as individuals take the responsibility for encounter and resolution. While these and other problems either directly oppressed us or rankled our consciences and became our own subjective concerns, we began to see complicated and disturbing paradoxes in our surrounding America. The declaration that all men are created equal rang hollow before the facts of Negro life in the South and the big cities of the North. The proclaimed peaceful intentions of the United States contradicted its economic and military investments in the Cold War status quo. We witnessed and will continue to witness other paradoxes. With nuclear energy, whole cities can be easily powered, yet the dominant nation states seem more likely to unleash destruction greater than that incurred in all wars of human history. Although our own technology is destroying old and creating new forms of social organization, men still tolerate meaningless work and idleness. While two-thirds of mankind suffers undernourishment, our own upper classes reveal amidst superfluous abundance. Although world population is expected to double in 40 years, all nations still tolerate anarchy as a major principle of international conduct, and uncontrolled exploitation governs the sapping of the Earth's physical resources. Although mankind desperately needs revolutionary leadership, America rests in national stalemate. Its goals ambiguous and tradition-bound instead of informed and clear. Its democratic system apathetic and manipulated rather than of, by, and for the people. Young Americans for Freedom. Liberal and radical SDS members on the left of the political spectrum found their counterpart on the right in the Students and the Young Americans for Freedom, YAF. While SDS members distributed anti-war literature, YAF members handed out pro-war pamphlets. Though SDS and YAF had sharply divergent political goals, both insisted on the rights of freedom of speech and assembly. The YAF championed lower taxes, less government regulation. While SDS members distributed anti-war literature, YAF members handed out pro-war pamphlets. Though SDS and YAF had sharply divergent political goals, both insisted on the rights of freedom of speech and assembly. The YAF championed lower taxes, less government regulation, and strenuous anti-communism. Unlike SDS, which vigorously opposed the Vietnam War, the 60,000 members of YAF believed the United States needed to beat back the tide of communist aggression in Southeast Asia. One of the group's older advisors was William F. Buckley, a leading conservative writer who edited the influential journal, The National Review. Many young conservatives adopted Buckley as their intellectual champion. Resisting the draft. In the mid-1960s, as America's involvement in Vietnam escalated, many young people directed their anger at the draft. Although full-time college students were eligible for deferments that allowed them to postpone military service, many students burned their draft registration cards in public rallies. Counseling centers helped young men get medical deferments by elevating blood pressure or by wearing fake corrective lenses. Dr. Benjamin Spock, the baby boom child care guru who turned anti-war activist, was tried and convicted for encouraging draft evasion. Some young men simply refused to register for the draft. Tens of thousands avoided the draft by fleeing the country. Many of these so-called draft dodgers fled to Canada or Sweden. Some conscientious objectors, for example those with pacifist religious affiliations, avoided the front lines and performed alternative service in non-combat military roles. Many men joined the National Guard or military reserve units that were unlikely to be called to action. The counterculture. While the student movement affected most campuses in the 1960s, only 10% of students participated in demonstrations, and even fewer, roughly 2 to 3%, considered themselves activists. Even if most students did not engage in radical politics, many young people participated in activities that broke sharply with traditional social conventions. Rejecting the conservative dress code of the 1950s college campus, they donned faded blue jeans, sandals, and tie-dyed shirts. Men grew their hair long, women wore love beads. Some left comfortable suburban homes to try collective living in rural communes on urban lofts. In rejecting traditional American values and models of behavior, these young people were forming a counterculture. The counterculture of the 1960s and 70s embraced a host of practices from vegetarianism to Eastern mysticism. Counterculture youth rejected the establishment, the reigning social order of their parents, which they associated with the war, a 9-to-5 corporate mentality, and an ideology that equated the good life with material comfort. The 1960s and 70s, some counterculture behaviors greatly worried middle-class adults. What were parents to make of the son or daughter who had excelled in high school but now dropped out of college and seemed unconcerned with the world of work and responsibility? Worse, what if the son or daughter joined a group of hippies and piled into an old hand-painted bus and headed for Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco? A neighborhood famous for drug experimentation and free love. Drug use was part of the counterculture. Polls revealed that many young people had tried smoking marijuana. Some tried hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD. It was widely rumored that the Beatles' 1967 song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, with its image of a girl with kaleidoscope eyes, invoked a drug trip, an LSD-induced psychedelic experience, though John Lennon of the Beatles scoffed at the notion. And let's read this excerpt here before we go on to Woodstock. Bob Dylan. No one captured the spirit of youth rebellion better than Bob Dylan, born Robert Allen Zimmerman, a young folk and rock musician from Minnesota who emerged in the early 1960s as one of the country's most popular and influential songwriters. Modeling himself after Woody Guthrie, Dylan loaded his music with social and political meaning. In songs like Oxford Town and The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, he chronicled episodes in the black civil rights struggle. In Masters of War, he gave voice to the anger and disgust of the anti-war movement. An enigmatic character who, as his career evolved, shrouded his life story beneath layers of misdirection, Dylan wrote songs that became anthems of the youth movement, such as Blowing in the Wind and The Times They Are Changin', to which he declared, "Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly agin'. Please get out of the new one. if you can't lend your hand for the times they are a-changin'. And we'll end this video here and start up the next one with Woodstock.